Hello, everyone. We're at the final panel session of Reframing Africa, and we hope that you're going to stay for the conversation with Teddy Matera that follows. So welcome to this session, which is called Empowering the Archive. I'm the other mysterious co-convener of Reframing Africa. My name is Cynthia Kros. Hasn't it started? Okay. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the final panel session of the Reframing Africa workshop called Empowering the Archive. I'm Cynthia Kros. I'm the mysterious other co-convener that you've heard of up till now. I'm an honorary research associate with the History Workshop at Wits University. I'm also an honorary research associate at the same unit as Emma at the University of Cape Town, which is called the Archive and Public Culture Research Initiative. So, empowering the archive, well, it's something that we've often addressed during these reframing conferences, and every time we manage to cast new light on the question and bring out new aspects. So I've been interested, it's already been mentioned quite a few times when you think back to Eva Knopf's presentation on Majub, how to deal with that very difficult colonial archive of Nazi Germany. And then just now in the previous session, Emil Shifty was talking about it's so hard when you're looking for the colonized or the Zanzibari in his case. You have to keep on hitting the pause button when you're watching colonial films to see them. So this is a thread that's running through all our conversations, really interesting. And now we're going to address some of the questions in detail. So we're going to start with Emma Sandon, who's a lecturer at Birkbeck in London. And she's also on the core team of colonial film, moving images of the British Empire. And the title of her paper is Colonial Film Archives, Working with the Moving Image. She's going to be followed by Renata Barreto, who's a second-year PhD student at the University of Colorado, Boulder. And the title of her paper is, I actually gave her a title, so I hope you don't mind, Renata, but what you're looking at is a particular kind of archive in the work of Zózimo Bulbul. And then finally, Jacob Cloete, who promised us that he was going to come with something totally different. And I think that he has been, I think that we won't be disappointed in what he has brought to us in the way of sand rock art, and the title of his paper is Envisaging a Decolonised Subjectivity. So without further ado, let's turn to Emma. Thanks, Emma.
Thanks very much to Cynthia, Kros and Pervaiz, Pervaiz and Cynthia and the whole advisory group. Actually, that's a large team that runs Reframing Africa. And I'm very pleased to be here this year. I haven't been able to attend, even though I've known about you for the last few years, because it hits the British academic October start, and it's impossible to get going over to South Africa. But this time, because of the virus and because of the possibility of joining you, I'm really pleased to have been at this really, really fertile couple of days. So without further ado, I shall head off because I just want to really introduce the background to attempts to empower the archive, or rather maybe frustrations in trying to empower the archive in the work I've been doing. As John Okonfor said yesterday, the majority of cinema in the archives is made up of films made by medical doctors and missionaries, and the ethnographic film is from where cinema emerged. A history that a number of scholars have traced, like Fatima Tobing-Roney, The Third Eye, Catherine Grew on bad film histories, and many others looking at the studies of the conjunction of race and cinema. And I have been particularly looking at colonial film for many years, since 1994, in fact, when I first started researching colonial film shot in Africa at the British Film Institute and some other British archives, to report on their colonial holdings and to get a sense of them. And in my examples today, I'm looking at missionary film, and that's been an area that I've been trying to develop and slowly writing about and collecting other people's papers in order to try and edit a book on missionary film. And so the idea of medical doctors and missionaries is really key to the two archives, the project I'm trying to work on now with colleagues. So when I started that research in mid-90s, my motivation was that British film history had failed to acknowledge its colonial past and preferred to concentrate on British national film history. And I thought that the colonial film record needed investigating, and that historians, imperial historians, colonial historians generally, who often ignored film and cinema as a source, needed to engage with the history of film and its use in the 20th century and the power of cinema within that enterprise. Of course, there are obviously historians, and a couple of African historians in particular, who are accepted from that at the time, but there was very little use of film on the colonial film archives when I was looking at it at that time. So I was based doing some of my research at the, I wasn't working for the BFI, I was in a placement at the BFI. I was studying film, and I asked if I could do my search for the National Film Archives there at the British Film Institute in collaboration with June Giovanni, who had a short spell as head of the Afro-Caribbean unit, a short and very important spell between 1994 and 98. At the BFI, where she was head of the Afro-Caribbean unit and was joined by Galen Gould. Two key people in British film now in London, based in London, who do such incredible work. Galen Gould's at the BFI programming now and enables a lot of things to happen that never happened before. June Giovanni, I'm on her advisory board of the June Giovanni Pan-African Cinema Archive, a very important archive of film and film history in Africa. So June at the time was organising a conference and film festival on African cinema in London as part of Africa 95. And she set up an advisory group for me to report to, which included the filmmakers and scholars, John Okomfo and Imru Bakari, along with the non-fiction film curators. And my brief was to locate footage or films shot by Africans prior to independence. Now, we already knew that it was very unlikely I'd find anyone, and we know that there's a different history in Francophone Africa that Jehan has talked about. So apart from the Gold Coast Film Unit, which we already knew about, I was not able to locate films in which Africans were allowed access to the means of film production at all. However, it quickly became clear that the archive was full of material shot across Africa and across Empire, in which Africans were the facilitators of film production, the subjects and actors from the beginnings of cinema in 1895-96. I found out at the same time that ASHAC, a research group on colonialism in France, as historians, were researching colonial film held at the French National Archive on a project, Images et Colonies, in which they screened materials in Paris and ran a conference in 1994, which would have been around the centenary of cinema, which led to the restoration and cataloguing of films at CNC, the Centre National de Cinema, but it didn't lead to any digitization or access in particular. And actually, unfortunately, that project's very difficult to find any reference to now of the amount of stuff they streamed and the important papers they did. Anyway, needless to say, my report and recommendations were shelved, and that was to do a whole lot of work, scholarly and filmmakers, to work on with the archives and problematize the archive, and it was shelved. But it did raise with the archive the extent of their colonial collections, and the longer outcome was the British Colonial Film Project, which ran from 2007 to 2010, led by Colin McCabe and Lee Greaveson, on which I was an advisor. This resulted in the online catalogue that many of you have probably used or looked at, and related publications called Empire and Film at the End of Empire, which has a lot of good articles and reflections on the process of 3 archive collections: the British Film Institute, the Imperial War Museum, and the British Empire and Commonwealth Collection. Now, key to this project's aims, which was unusual and we insisted on, was a critical engagement with colonialism informed by anti-colonial sentiment, and that it was important that we were able to involve Black, British, African and Asian diaspora filmmakers and cultural historians, and that there was an editorial commitment to critical analysis and context to the entries that are put up online. We were very aware how difficult these images were, and to ensure also that it wasn't just nationally accessible, that it was internationally accessible. It was a project that would never get funding now, and it was fraught with institutional difficulties and funding crises, and it was just a start, really, or was supposed to be just a start to exposing and engaging with these collections. The Colonial Film Database is not part of the British Film Institute website. They won't put it up there, although BFI is supposed to be maintaining it technically over 2 5-year agreements, and we're not sure whether they'll renew it again. But it's often the films don't run. I'm often getting emails, and so do my colleagues, that it's not running due to the Adobe Flash updates, and it will not be supported on that video format after this year, which is really short-sighted of the whole project, but that's the way technology also changes, and the BFI is always strapped for money. So now, if you want to get the films to show, if you're having trouble, you have to disable any blocks on Adobe Flash on Chrome on your computer to allow the films to run. So I'll keep you posted. If anyone needs to know, do email me, but basically we'll see what happens after this year. I'm talking to the BFI next month about what the hell they can do before raising it with the rest of the team. The BFI now says it's aiming to digitize its colonial film collections when it gets funding. And that's the key thing. When will it get funding? Will it get funding? And it's something that has been in a discussion just recently that June Giovanni was running, You Hide Me, the 50 years anniversary of the film by Cloete, that Jehan was part of a discussion on, which has been run at SOAS and through the June Giovanni archive. And Robin Baker from the BFI says he's going to be looking for funding. So the issue now, the access and use is still really difficult years later and financially untenable because the collections are monetized and you have to pay for commercial rates for anything you want to get transferred and licenses that you can't clear to use, as many of the filmmakers have talked about today. So just checking on time. Other collections, apart from the British Film Institute, the project I'm working on now with various colleagues, including Jay Maingard, who's here attending this process, but other colleagues based in India and other universities in England, is that we're trying to raise academic funds, which is the only way to get funds at the moment, through universities and collaborations and partnerships to get access to work on the films held at the British Empire and Commonwealth collections in Bristol. And that was partially, some of those films were actually put up on the Colonial Film site. And the other big source of films is the Wellcome Trust. The project that we're proposing includes scholarly writings and publications ongoing, as many of us have been doing, but also importantly, a practice engagement by which artists and filmmakers can reuse and confront the images and narratives using editing, sound, oral histories, counter narratives, collage, layering, installation, or to quote, undoing and remake, as Isaac Julian said in his essay for the Colonial Film Project, where he indicates that the issues of engaging with the ghosting of the imperial past and rereading it picks up from critiques that Sankofa, Chedo, and Black Audio Film Workshops raised in the 80s and 90s in Britain when they were funded. And it seems from this conference and the fabulous work presented here by filmmakers, archivists, and scholars that this moment has come round yet again. And it's important that we continue to make demands of our rights to access and work with these materials. The BEC is it had a few films put up on the Colonial Film site, but this collection has been out of bounds for some time and just recently been acquired by the Bristol Museums, which makes it a public collection. So it was a private collection, publicly funded, and now it's publicly funded. It has home movie collections, 8mm, 16mm, and it's covering a whole range of colonial life, shot by district commissioners, colonial officers and their families, work-related footage by technicians, engineers, geologists, people working for agriculture, forestry departments from points of view of working for the British colonial services.
Emma, I'm sorry, you've got very little time left. Maybe you want to move on really fast.
Yes, I'm moving straight to that now. Wellcome, moving really fast. Wellcome has a private collection of medical films and scientific and missionary films. I'm not going to talk about that now. The difficulties I just want to say before I just talk about the excerpts is that the issues are the lack of access and use, and the issues of are not just access and use and donors' rights, that the archives won't let us access the collection, but also it raises issues of care and ethics, which have been raised again and again at this conference. And so the issues about law in terms of rights and finance monetization has different applications, whether there's a private or public character of collections. And then, of course, we're not talking about the amount of films, images, and objects moving around between collectors in auctions, which Paul Weinberg talked about yesterday. There's a lot of stuff there. The excerpts. Okay, I uploaded 3 excerpts, and I hope you get time to see them. And I warned you about the offensive nature of these. The first screenshot, if I could have that now, is St. Joe's Missionary Society, the Mill Hill Fathers, Mill Hill Sisters in Uganda, 1920. So this is really early on. And the clips from the St. Joseph's Missionary Society about their hospital, which was up on Nsamba Hill in Uganda, where they established a school and a hospital. We don't know much about the contents of the film, and the mission hasn't given us paperwork, but there's ongoing attempts to look at this work, which is extremely primitivist in the way its discourse works. And maybe I can talk about that in discussion. Screenshot 2 is a Methodist Missionary Society film, which was made about in 1928, which is also quite early on, to show how film was being used by the missionaries, but also the film itself reveals the kind of way in which the Methodists tried to convert, and the footage at the end of that clip around the Johannesburg mining scenes are really documentarily important, but also show the mission at work in terms of its way of trying to convert. Screenshot 3, the visitation, I put this in because it's very much, although it's from the Irish Film Archives, it's been recently kind of discovered, and it's very much a Catholic Film Society filmmaker who worked with the Medical Missionaries of Mary around their leprosy scheme in Agoja in Nigeria. And this is a very developmental type of approach in terms of its 1948 production. And you can see the way the music and the documentary process creates a kind of nostalgia and a very different type of image to the other clips. So I'm not going to alert you to the websites of the Colonial Film BECC and Welcome, but I did have screenshots. So if you want those details, I can show you where the catalogs are for all these films. But maybe you could raise questions about and chat about the different clips I've put up and the stills. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Emma. And just to remind everyone that there are excerpts available if you click on the appropriate places on the program. And yes, I'm sure that we'll want to discuss how you go about rereading these images when we get to Q&A. But thanks very much, Emma. And now we move on to Renata. Renata, are you ready? Renata, are you sure you've unmuted?
I'm so sorry. So thank you so much for this opportunity to be here and share my research with you today. I am a historian, filmmaker, and an artist, and I have been working creatively with archives throughout my career. And today I will again bring to light the Brazilian archive through the important figure of the Brazilian artist and activist Zózimo Bulbul, and his first film as a director called Alma no Olho, or Soul in the Eye in English, from 1973. It is a short 11-minute film where Bulbul is performing using only his body, an apparently linear and contained in space narrative of the diasporic African Brazilian experience. But actually, we'll see how Bulbul is actually offering a way out of this linear time and scale space. If I can have the first slide, please. So first I will talk a bit about his career as an engaged artist, and then I will make this hermeneutical analysis of the film in relation to Professor Ferreira da Silva's text, Toward a Black Feminist Poetics, the question of blackness toward the end of the world. So, Zózimo Bulbul, he has more than 30 films as an actor in Brazil in the 60s and 50s. And he was always involved with avant-garde political movements, such as Cinema Novo, the third cinema movement from Brazil. But unsatisfied with the small symbolical representation of African Brazilians in screen. He made the movement that we called aquilombamento, or which characterizes this formation of Black cultural centers, festivals for Black cinema, and also prioritizing diasporic and decolonial thematics. Alma no Olho, So in the Eye is produced, direct and performed by him. And in the Brazilian context, it is a revolutionary film with a high degree of aesthetical sophistication. It was done in the most violent period of the military dictatorship in Brazil. And just right after the film, he self-exiled for a while. And when he came back, he made a shift for documentary practice. And in 1988, with the centennial of the official slavery abolition in Brazil, he makes a political mark with a documentary called Abolition, or Abolição, standing publicly against the big national celebration of a supposed racial democracy, the myth of racial harmony in Brazil, which is a myth because never existed. While So in the Eye became a diasporic archive itself, Abolition makes the documentary movement in its structure, archival footage, interviews, visual registers, and scripted scenes combined to overlap the official historiography of the African Brazilian experience. Then in 2007, he will create the Afro-Carioca Cinema Center, which is a space for alternative memory, for understanding Blackness through cinematography. The center is a repository of the African Brazilian archive and is a prolific promoter of the African Brazilian culture and voice, promoting screenings, seminars, debates, and the exchange of experience between Brazil and Africa. In 2010, Zózimo Bulbul directed a film called African Reborn, solicited by Senegal's president to celebrate the 50-year independence of that country. And after his death in 2013, the historian and curator Janaína Oliveira, being the person responsible for making his legacy visible and giving continuity to this idea of Pan-African aquilombamento. I have some links available for you to check out the Afro-Carioca Cinema Center. And right now, the 13th Black Cinema Festival, which carries his name, it's a Zózimo Bulbul Black Cinema Festival, is happening right now, and gathering filmmakers from Africa, the Caribbean, and Brazil. So check it out. Brazil is the blackest country outside the African continent, where the racialized population of Native Americans and African Brazilians make up for the majority of the population. And yet, through all my years in academy in Brazil, in cinema studies and media studies, I never once had one lecture about him or even saw this film. Never once, never once. And that reflects the Brazilian art regime and its necropolitical state, which is intrinsically tied to the still colonial academic system and its epistemological control of the symbolic. Going back to the film, it was done in 1973, inspired by Eldridge Cleaver's book called Soul on Ice from 1968. He was an early leader of the Black Panthers Party. And we have John Coltrane as soundtrack, which is another political statement on the idea of Pan-Africanism. It is a film that shows the category of blackness being produced and trapped by the tools of universal reason, such as time and space, and at the same time offers a way out of it. Which leads us to Professor Da Silva's article, where she's suggesting that we have to radicalize the task of releasing blackness from the registers of the object. That meaning that we have to release blackness from being a commodity, from being the other, from being the exotic. And for that to happen, we must target the modes of representation of blackness, the philosophical assumptions that provide those meanings to blackness. Her text produces a reading of the grounds of the category of blackness in 4 movements. And I'm gonna go through these 4 movements in relation to the film. So in her first movement, she's working with the Trinidadian historian C.L.R. James, first chapter of the Black Jacobins, where he exposes the occlusion of the value of enslaved labor productive capacity. To Marx, the enslaved person would be seen just as property, okay? The value of labor of the enslaved population is dismissed, and the latter being considered just an object. And Bulbul uncovers this ongoing occlusion of the surplus value produced by enslaved labor, mediated by total violence that continues to sustain global capitalism. When he's stretching the period of enslavement, for example, the timeline, or putting low-wage labor and Black culture as a spectacle, as a continuity to slavery. In her second movement, she exposes how this idea of linear time is an artificial construction. So she makes this conceptual history of the principle of sameness and difference, development and the building of these racial categories from the Enlightenment tradition to contemporaneity. This system of thought produced slavery as the profitable tool of universal reason, one that authorizes total violence against racialized bodies, backed up by efficient causality, which is things like immanence or desire. And of course, film is the privileged medium to think about temporality. And in So in the Eye, Bulbul transits, shrinks, subverts the linear space-time, expands the official marks of the Brazilian slavery system, at the same time making himself vulnerable to it. So this otherness in the first, at first apparently timeline, linear timeline, is in direct conversation with Da Silva's text. In her third movement, she exposes how the category of blackness already carries the apparatus for dismantling the way of knowing that produced it in the first place. Blackness, self-knowing, announces the end of the world. For example, in the world as we know it, blackness, when an index of a social situation, never fails to signify slavery. For example, in Brazil, there are layers of blackness. And those layers of blackness are directly attached to social indicators. So that the poorer you are, the blackest you would be. But at the same time, this category of blackness exposes the ways in which the expropriated enslaved African productive capacity continues to sustain this dead living dead capital. And also Denise Ferreira da Silva is citing Orton's pillars to think about the flesh as the primary narrative because of the problem of the colonial archive, because the colonial archive was produced by the colonialists. So we must think about people, like the last panel we were talking about, how people must be the archive and must be the narrative. So flesh as the primary narrative, and Bulbul is displaying his flesh as the primary narrative, making the wounded body an inscription of calculated violence. Registers the body, the wounded body, registers with what the category of blackness hides, the ongoing living dead capital, profiting from expropriated productive capacity of racialized bodies.
Thanks, Renata. That was
I just have just the fourth. I'm concluding.
Okay, but your time is up, so if you can just
just concluding. In the fourth movement, she speculates on this feminist poetics of blackness, which outlines a description of existence without the limits of this universal reason. So it would be an existence outside space-time. And Bulbul also outlines symbolically this exit out of existence under the grips of universal reason. When, of course, he's stripping the white clothes and the white books and chains. And just like to conclude, Bulbul and da Silva, they both offers us a means to think of the end of the world as we know it, aiming at this Black feminist poetics project to reread and produce new archives. This would be my idea of Pan-Afro-futurism. Thank you so much.
Thanks very much, Renata. Thank you for bringing our attention to the work of Zózimo Bulbul and all these fantastic ideas, which I hope we get a chance to discuss. Thank you very much. And now, Jacob and his discoveries about rock art. Jacob, over to you. Jacob, did you unmute?
I didn't, sorry. Thank you, Cynthia. Firstly, I want to thank Cynthia and Pervaiz for giving me this opportunity to once again present at this particular platform. I also need to thank the Center for Humanities Research at UWC for making funds available for me to pursue this particular research. In particular, I would like to thank Premier Lalo and William Ellis in the mentoring role that they played in this project. I also want to thank Simone Momple, who have been part of this process from day one and was patient with me and go wherever I needed to go with this particular project. I also need to thank Peter Takello and the Barreto community because they opened their hearts and their homes to me to make this project a reality. And then finally, I want to recognize the Khoi and the San community, which is still largely the most marginalized community in South Africa. And with that, I say K Gangans. So can I please have the first slide? Just to give a structure with regards to how this presentation would be unfolding is there will be a background, some discussion on the interpretation of Sun rock art, limitations to Sun rock art, my critique of that interpretation. And then I want to go briefly into some of the findings that I made with regards to what Sun rock art can offer us in thinking a decolonized subjectivity. So movement, forced migrations, and land dispossession. So how I came about this particular, the discovery of this cave of rock art is while working on this documentary film, Save the River. So with the interviews with Peter Takello and Lando Iso, they keep talking about the cave full of rock art, which they didn't have access anymore because the Swellendam municipality sold it to a private owner, so they couldn't go to the cave and visit this particular ancestral place, sacred space of them. So I asked them, can I see it? So they said, yes, they will take me there. So the year after that, 2019, I went up and I went to go check out the cave with rock art, and this is what I found. So can I have slide 2, please? So from slide 2, you will see that there is a dynamic nature of this. You can see people in it. You can also bring up slide 3. Slide 3 shows you even more figures with regards to what the sun rock art is in Berrydale, what you can expect if you go there. So after the cave, I started reflecting, and I was thinking, what is this offering us? And I realized that the Berrydale rock art is telling us a story of the early inhabitants, how they lived and what they valued. I also realized that that particular site is an archive, and the people there who lived at that cave for ages, they wanted to preserve a memory. So, and it left me with a particular question. What did the sun try to preserve? What was this particular kind of memory that they wanted to preserve? And I realized that there's a story in the Khoi and Sun history that we are missing. They have an archive and they have a philosophy, but we yet have to understand that particular philosophy. So if we look at the interpretation of rock art, we will normally get two main scholars, J.D. Louvers and John Parkinson. And from their work, you will get to kind of 3 approaches for the interpretation of sun rock art. You get the narrative approach, and the narrative approach look at the composition of the rock art to construct a narrative. So one of the slides that I showed you, there is figures, so they use that figures to construct a composition and draw a narrative. The second one is the aesthetic approach. Here you look at the beauty, the fine lines, and the delicate figures, and you have a kind of reading of that. And the third approach is a focus more on the interpretive, and the interpretive is more looking at the religious aspect of sun rock art. So if we can bring up slide 3 again, then you will see that we can use all 3 approaches to analyze that particular slide. Please bring up slide 4. So then we will start seeing that famous photo or the sketch of William Burchell. We can start making assumptions that the circles that we see on slide 3 can use this to make inferences with that particular one. Now, this brings me particularly to the limitations of rock art. So the work of Parkinson and Lewis Williams is not without limitations. And these particular limitations are because of the usage of the Bleek and Lloyd archives. And there's kind of 4 limitations that I came across. So the first one is the Ham language is not the only Sun language, but yet the orthography that they draw up is now used to translate all of the Sun rock art in Southern Africa. So that's kind of the second limitation. The third thing is with regards to European languages. And my experience with the Khoikhoi-Gowab, which is one of the oldest languages that preserve human history, is that the language, English, is almost incomplete in understanding the Khoikhoi-Gowab. And the same with the Kham language. It cannot interpret certain cultural nuances. So that's the third limitation, the translation of cultural nuances. And the fourth limitation is them labeling, and like many other scholars, labeling the Khoikhoi as pastoralists and the Sun as hunter and gatherers. So my critique is the following then, is that I am specifically departing from the conventional way of interpreting rock art. I'm not only interested in reading the images. I think that Parkinson and Lewis Williams are ignoring the politics that these images are provoking. So if you regard rock art as a pre-colonial archive, it brings forth the political. And you can go read Derrida. Derrida will explain that in more depth about the political that the archive provoke. So then rock art brings forth a debate on land dispossession, forced migration, the appropriation of indigenous knowledge systems, and the violence against the Khoi and the San. So that's my critique. So there's kind of three points that my research so far has opened up and forced me to have discussions and conversations with. And that is with regards to movement, forced migrations, and land dispossession. But if you look at the Berrydale rock art, then you will see movement, community, and livestock as central features in the Berrydale rock art. You cannot miss that. And they are outside the colonial frame. It opens several topics, which include land, violence, race, and class. William Ellis, in particular, employs a cinematic reading of rock art. And for me, that was very productive because it draws on the work of Henry Bergson, Gauss Zulu, and Suleiman Bashir Jan. And if you look at rock art as a cinematic movement, then it opens new possibilities for the interpretation of rock art. If we think movement in a Bergsonian sense and the Duluian sense, then it brings forth the movement image, and the movement image brings forth movement. So if we look at movement, then it's thought-provoking in some rock art, because most of the Berrydale rock art images is about moving or symbolizing movement. The movement is not only in directional way, but it's also about executing actions and tasks. So there's directional movement, and this directional movement is from left to right, right to left, up and down. So you see that kind of movement in the rock art. So if we bring up a slide 4 now, then you will see that kind of movement. You can see that there is movement taking place. If you bring up slide 5, then you will see the execution of specific tasks that is taking place. Sorry, slide 5 and 6 is the ones with a movement. So this art then is indicating a dynamic pre-colonial movement, and this directional movement is not only of humans but also of animals. So, and the animals in those photos that I took of the Sun Rock art becomes central in the question: was this game or was this livestock? Because if you read the William Burchell account, then one of the things that you realize is that the sun also had livestock. They did not only move with game. So then those images, is it images of a pastoralist or is it the image of a hunter-gatherer? And that is the big question that we have to think about. So then the classification of people and things is a result of taxonomy. And taxonomy was birthed in the European University. Taxonomy instituted coloniality and gave rise to the university in Africa, which in turn appropriated indigenous knowledge systems. And what I meant by that is that the Khoisan currently have to learn in the university about the Khoisan and not from themselves about it. So their knowledge system is appropriated. So in conclusion, the frames that we sometimes establish is inadequate to give us the full picture of the complexity of a particular situation. For example, the photos that I took. The photos is giving you a snapshot. It excludes some of the images outside the frame. So to get a full understanding of the scope of the art, I have to give you more, or not just those few photos that I showed you. But these frames that we sometimes establish also inform subjectivity. For example, during apartheid and colonialism, the Khoi and the San was forced into the colored identity in particular. So thus arriving at the decolonized subjectivity is starting recognizing the frame and the power relations that establish these identities. For example, Hottentot and Boesman, or pastoralist and hunter and gatherer, is the framing of this particular group of people. And these labels stripped the Khoisan son of their identity and left them without a specific philosophical project. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Jacob. I think I forgot to introduce you in the beginning because you seem like such an institution of Reframing Africa. But Jacob Cloete is an independent filmmaker and a political analyst and writer. That's great, Jacob. I think that Teddy Batera, who we're going to be talking with soon, has observed that in a way rock art might be seen as the forerunner of African cinema. So it's really interesting the way you've developed these ideas. And I think exactly that rock art offers us such a tantalizing view into an alternative worldview or an alternative knowledge system. And yet the ways that we have to get there are so flawed and difficult, but yet Jacob's giving us very interesting ideas about how we may be able to get a glimpse of that after all. So thanks very much, Jacob. Now we can go into the question and answer session. I think that Emma knows what her question is. She's going to talk to us about how she's been rereading these very difficult images that she's shown us. I don't see any questions yet. Renata, I'd like it if you talked a bit more about Bulbul's strategies, for example, how he does escape linear time. I think I'd really like to get more of a handle on that. And Jacob, well, let's see if some questions come up for you, then I'll think of one for you. So Emma, let's go back to you.
Yeah, just thanks, Cynthia. Great other papers as well. Thanks, Renata and Jacob. Yeah, I think one of the issues really is, obviously, I'm trying to get access and money, and one of the ways I've been working has been through formal scholarship in terms of researching context and looking at the way in which people are using film, particularly missionary groups, and to kind of insert that really within histories. So, you know, academic scholarship and papers and context are ways of kind of rereading the kind of context of the films, but with close film analysis, which I think a lot of historians might take film as a kind of side show really, and don't really look at the issues of aesthetics, narrative, and form. And just looking at the three clips and extracts that I've put up, they have very different narrative approaches. So you kind of see the final one I mentioned, the visitation, really uses a kind of documentary aesthetic and a kind of music and sound. So I think one of the ways that we've successfully seen artists use, and it's been talked about here yesterday and today, is to use music and sound to kind of reread and reanimate certainly silent cinema, and this can be done in ways which are really radical and shift one's perspective from the discourses that are there. The other way is, a lot of people have been talking about intervening in terms of bringing out aspects of the image, slow motion, stills, ways of which you interact in terms of montage or comparison. So I think in some ways one can, there's been so many examples and ideas given at this conference, you could put those together to say that these are, you know, counter strategies and counter narratives. And I don't know how many people know the work of Onyeka Igwe, who has been working as a practice PhD in London on colonial film. And she first came to me to ask about the colonial film site, and said she wanted to work practically with the colonial archive, and I didn't have the resources at Birkbeck, so sent her to the University of Arts London, which has much more an artist base and practice there. And she's produced some amazing films whereby she's looking, as John Okomfora says, looking for herself in the archive and then reworking ideas around Nigerian practice and forms of filmmaking using colonial film, particularly looking, first of all, her first films were around looking at dance, and then thinking about dance and performance, but also introducing her narratives of her her ancestry, her relationship with these images, and also doing performance herself. So Onyeka's a very great example of work, and I'd recommend people look at her stuff. But yeah, there's too many examples now. Quite a lot of people are working with archive, and I just feel I'm stuck on the access and use. But I feel that there's ways in which, and of course I'm interested to look not just at the individual films, either in a scholarly way or reworking the images, but actually thinking about bodies of film. So, you know, the importance is not just state propaganda that was going on. Missionaries and medical film really is a huge part of the way in which education and hospitals were set up. And these are also in some kind of way records. And something like St. Joseph's Missionary Society, you look at it, it kind of decolonizes itself. Suddenly you have to reverse that image when you look at it. Already it has text which talks about savages, and you feel St. Joe's missionaries are the savages involved. And then they are really people, you kind of look with horror really at how the missionaries intervened in that way. So sometimes the films deconstruct themselves on being shown, but in other ways you need to kind of work very hard, as everyone says. And now, did I pick up that? Sorry to go on because I don't see the questions, but I do see someone coming up with a question. How are the archives being troubled? How they're contextualized, humanized? What processes are put in place to decolonize these archives as they're presented? I don't know if I covered some of that now and what I've just said.
I think you have to a certain extent, but I'm thinking about those very difficult images, you know, with people with leprosy and so on being exhibited in the film excerpts that you sent us. And then particularly with where people are rotated, almost as if they were 3D images, and they're rotated so that we can get the full a sense of the full extent of their diseased flesh or whatever it is. Now, how do you work with those? That seems to be very tricky.
Well, I suppose that, you know, those are examples of the completely dehumanizing way in which the colonizers, filmmakers and missionaries used African subjects in order to develop their films and also to raise funds for their projects. So in ways you have to kind of use them in ways which are completely critiquing, either with text, sound, stop, start. I haven't really worked with those images myself, but I have seen them. I think Onyeka has successfully used some images like that if you put them in a context of a voiceover text commentary sound that really shows another point of view about what's happening there. I put that up because actually looking at the various missionary and medical films, there's a complete obsession with leprosy colonies, and I would say it's practically like a genre. That the kind of funding that was raised and went into filming and experimenting with Western medicine within all parts of the empire. You can see by the amount of footage and film that is around about that actually is a highly problematic genre, I would say, and one that needs to be seriously countered within any scholarship or filmic way of dealing with it.
Yeah, thanks. It's almost as if leprosy becomes a spectacle. It's very troubling. Yeah, interesting. Thanks very much for that. Renata, can we go to you now? Could you just elaborate, because you gave us such a wealth of ideas, but it would help us if you could just elaborate a bit more on some of them. Thanks.
Of course. I was just saying that film is the privileged medium to think about temporality. And what Professor Da Silva is doing in her text is trying to expose how our idea, this idea of linear time, is constructed, is artificial. And it was thought throughout the Enlightenment. And because before that, in Europe, medieval time was counted differently. So our idea of time is a modern event. And together with modernity, not only the linear time, but the idea of blackness, the category of blackness was created together with the linear time, the idea of development, the idea of teleology, that everyone would have the same destiny, the same finality. So when Bulbul performs his narrative of the Brazilian, African-Brazilian diasporic experience, he's of course doing that on film, so he's working this time around. And more than that, he gives us an alternative view of this linear time and makes a critique over how this time is being portrayed by the official historiography. So in the film, of course, as I said, he's stretching the period of slavery to say that contemporary Brazil is still living on a slavery system with the low-wage labor complex that we have, and also with making Black culture as a spectacle and hypersexualizing racialized bodies. So this is the first movement where he is stretching and working on this timeline. But in the end, it's only in the end that we can recognize that, because he's putting the contemporary Brazilian Black man as still enslaved by epistemology when he's reading the book with the chains. And then he suggests this movement of breaking the chains, but suggesting also that the chains were not break before. So that's how he's working this temporality. I think he's doing a very severe critique on the official historiography of Brazil.
Sounds fantastic. Thanks very much. I've got a question for you. Maybe I'll read it to you and you can think about what, and I'll move to Jacob, because I think there might be some interesting connections here around oppositions to linear time. Okay, so Renata, someone has asked you, this is from Henke. I'm also wondering about the function of self-implication in archival work from the archive scholar artist as in Bubu. What are the implications and what gets lost when self-implication is avoided? Is that clear to you? Yeah. Okay, so you just think about it, okay. And I'm going to move to Jacob. Okay, because Bettina asks, would you say this link to the movement image, Jacob, places the stand in relation to modernity in some way via mobility? So all these questions about modernity and linear time, and how does the art position itself? You know, think about how you might address that. And then another question from Reece, also for you, Jacob. Would you expand on the idea of the movement image in rock art as a pre-cinematic vector of memory and knowledge production? Yes, so they were trying to tie it. I think I cited Teddy saying, in a way, rock art can be seen as the forerunner of African cinema. So now Reece is asking you, could you see it as a pre-cinematic vector of memory and knowledge production? Maybe you also need to think about that, and I'll go back to Renata while you do. Okay, Renata. The question about self-implication.
Yeah, I'm thinking here that I don't think that the Bulbul is not self-implicating in this work. I think he's putting his body out there, and as I said, the worst moment, the most violent period of Brazilian military dictatorship, where not only communists, but mostly racialized people were being arrested and tortured and killed by the regime. So he's actually putting himself out there, performing a statement, a political statement, I think. And I'm not sure if I got the question right, but I don't think that I don't think nothing is lost with self-implication, because if you don't put yourself out there, if you don't even more when you're doing performance, it is a political statement. It is self-implicative. Yeah.
Thanks, Renata. Sorry, that question actually came from Diego Semereni. Okay, thanks very much. Okay, let's go. Jacob, have you got an answer ready for us now?
I hope I will do justice. So I'll start with the first question with regards to the movement image places the sun in relation to modernity and coloniality. I would place myself in the decolonial school of thought. So if I place myself in the decolonial school of thought, then modernity and coloniality is the same thing. And that starts with the conquest and the conquistadors during the Southern America chapter of colonialism. And what we find there is that there is kind of a colonial matrix of power that they have 4 domains. And these 4 domains are the control of the economy, control of authority, control of gender and sexuality, and then control of knowledge and subjectivity. And I don't want us to think about sun rock art in relation to modernity. So to answer both those questions, I believe that we don't have the tools yet to philosophically understand the Khoi and the sun's philosophical project. Because if we try and make sense of their philosophical project based on the fight that we currently have in terms of coloniality and modernity, and we don't recognize that the university have appropriated this knowledge and firmly embedded it in coloniality and modernity, then we cannot have an answer or render analysis on the Khoi-San philosophical project. So I don't think we have the tools yet. So what I'm offering is kind of us to think about how would we differently approach the subject of Southern rock art, or Khoi-San sun rock art in Southern Africa. But it's only one part of my investigation. I'm also doing work on the dance, the real dance. And in the dance, you will find various types of movements. And what you find with that dance is that there was a pre-colonial integration among the Tswana, the Xhosa, and the Khoi. So you see this fluid identities where people could move in and out between identities. You could even pick that up in the language between the Xhosa and the Khoikhoi. The clicks that you find in Xhosa, the 3 clicks, all of that is 3 clicks part of the Khoikhoi. The Khoikhoi have a 4th click, which is an ah. So all of those clicks, all of the language, the dance, the art, all of those different aspects is giving us an opportunity to rethink what we are currently struggling in the university. And I don't think coloniality or thinking in coloniality will take us there. In terms of the movement image, I'm using the movement image in terms of memory. So when you think about memory, or when you recall in memory a movement, it's always an image. It's never a movement fully. So you think, when you think about taking a step, what comes into your mind is an image. In that sense, I'm taking the movement image in that Brixonian and that type of Deluan way. So I cannot fully answer this question yet. It's actually a question that we all have to try and answer.
Thanks, Jacob. And just quickly, because we're running out of time. So it sounds like you're expecting to discover some new tools in the course of your investigation. And so do you recommend discarding the archive that we've discussed? You've drawn our attention to its flaws. And are you recommending that we just discard that Black Lloyd archive, for example, and try and approach it in a totally different way?
So I would take the dead end way. I would say is that the archive is useful, but we have to think about the politics that put the archive in place. We need to think about that power relation, because that will give us a fuller extent of the frame of the archive and the project that was behind it. So we look at the Khoisan rock art. If we look at it as an archive, we need to think about a pre-colonial political project. And in my investigation, future investigation, maybe I'll get to an answer or maybe not. But what is, if I can place Sun rock art as an archive, then we have to think about the politics that was there involved and any other archive. We cannot ignore the politics that is involved in the archive. That is kind of what I'm offering.
Thanks so much, Jacob. I can't believe that we've got this far in our workshop without mentioning Derrida. Thanks very much for reminding us that we should be thinking about the politics of the archive. Thanks a lot. And Renata, there's a question for you, and I'm also going to ask you if you can answer it briefly so we can give Emma a chance to come back with one last comment. Okay, Renata, the question from you, again from Diego, is considering the current extreme right government in Brazil, are the circumstances similar to those at the time of Bubu's film? If so, has an artistic activism emerged lately? Okay, did you get it?
Yeah, the circumstances are maybe similar, but I think they are much worse now. Because of the whole global situation. But in fact, an artistic activism emerged in the last 20 years because of the left government we have from Lula da Silva. And he created many ways, many exits for the Black movement and Black activism to emerge. But now things are very difficult back there in all areas.
Yeah, it sounds as if that's the case. And you're not exactly finding a refuge in the US, I imagine.
Yeah, no.
Okay, we only have a few minutes left. So Emma, what are your thoughts now?
Well, just to kind of pick up from Jacob's point about the politics of the archive, I think the context to what I've presented is really that the archives are promising to digitize, but they're not really making the archive accessible for us to decolonize the film archive, to work with it practically, or even for scholarship. Even viewing rights are often very contained, if not expensive and impossible, as Jihan and many others have talked about. And so the politics of the archive is, if you look at the British Empire and Commonwealth Museum collection, they started to digitize and put stuff up. Now, they haven't put the St. Joseph's stuff up yet, and we'll be interested to see if they do. I got them to the mission to agree that they could be digitized, but whether they put them up or not, I wouldn't particularly want to see them up. But what they're doing is putting up the family archive, and if you go in, you just find a family's name and you look at the collection, and there are the nice domestic home movies of the donors, and this is highly nostalgic, if nothing else. And sometimes they've invited the donors to see the film, so everybody sits there and thinks back of the old times of the 50s and 60s. It's absurd, you know, that there isn't a critical engagement with the archive. And the archive is, as we know, as they do in South Africa, they kind of police the archive. They don't let you have stuff, they don't let filmmakers have stuff, and they also don't want you to work with it, and if in doubt, they will just let you view things and they won't let you work with it, and they'll start saying the donors are giving it to us, it's not ours, or there's this law or that law. So really, to decolonize the film archives, we've got to really campaign now while the political moment is high, and try to get people to access so that students can go in and work with this stuff and kind of work against what the archive shows and how it produces it, how it reproduces it as it does at the moment.
So earlier on today, Simon Bright called on Abu Bakr and Pervaiz and me to think about practical steps we can take to start to rectify some of this. What would you say? I mean, do you have any ideas on how we can start moving in that kind of direction?
Well, I'm sure Reece and everyone else would have plenty of ideas, because June Giovanni has just been running, there's one more of those, if you can, on the 29th of October, if you look on her archive site, she's running the You Hide Me, the discussions around archive, and they've been, the last two have been really brilliant, with Jihan and Nikwate, Onyeka was there, various others have been involved, Reece, Imru, and so basically the argument is to really start arguing with the owners, like the curators of the BFI and others, to make stuff accessible. I think Jihan has said this very clearly during the debate with the Donna Conflict. No, we have to have access to this material to see what we want to make. We have the right to look at it and work with it, and therefore we need to link up. So there's already a forum through June. I think there's a wide forum. FESPACO, Gaston Cabot at the last FESPACO was saying, we really need to be able to access these colonial archives, and they're not forthcoming. So I think there's plenty of networks all around. It's about tapping into them and actually getting those connected. Now we can do that digitally.
Great, thanks very much. And now we've got 3 minutes remaining, so I'm just going to go back to Renata. Is there anything you'd like to say in conclusion, Renata?
I would like to thank you all for the opportunity of being here and share my research with you. Thank you. I hope that I can come back next time. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Renata. Well, we're planning to have a Brazilian extension, so I'm sure you will come back. Thanks very much. And Jacob, any parting words from you?
Yeah, I have to say something before I say goodbye, is that we must not think of rock art in terms of the cinema, because the cinema frames and rock art doesn't frame. If you go to any rock art site, there is no frames involved. And the cinema has is using a selective medium of framing. So when I say the possibility is cinematic, what I'm talking about is the figures are moving. They're executing actions. You can imagine it, you can see it. There is movement. But a rock art site doesn't have frames. It's all over, and the artist placed it where he or she thought it was the best place to put it. So that's one of the things that I want to caution us going forward in thinking the cinema in relation to Sun rock art. The Sun, we are framing it. If we take a photo, we take a video of it, we are framing it in this thing that we develop in modernity. And then we commercialize it and we sell it and we appropriate a particular knowledge. So I just want to put that out there. Thank you very much, Cynthia and Pervaiz and the whole team of the Market Workshop and Wits University and the people who tuned in today to watch. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jacob, and I'm glad you said he or she, because normally we assume that sand rock artists were male. So it's interesting to say we don't know actually about that. And so I think that we better call our next edition Unframing Africa. But thank you very much for making that point. It was very good. So thank you very much to all of you panelists and to the audience, and yes, to our technical team who's kept us live, and to everybody. It was great. Don't forget, it's not over yet, because we're still going to have a conversation with Teddy Matera in a little while. So thanks very much and goodbye.